Question number 1. Tell us a little about yourself, such as your name, where you received your training, and your experience.
Hi there, I'm Dustin McClaws. I'm an interpreter in the Valley. I was born and raised in the Phoenix area. I first started learning American Sign Language in high school when I took ASL to meet my language requirements. I enjoyed ASL and continued on into college, where I graduated from the University of Arizona's Educational Interpreter Training Program. Funny enough, my niece is now learning ASL from my very first ASL teacher.
That's awesome. We got to learn a lot about your time at the U of A, your old stomping grounds. Who and what inspired you to become an interpreter?
My high school ASL teacher is the one who encouraged me to pursue interpreting. So I naively enrolled in the interpreting program at the University of Arizona. At the time, I really didn't know what an interpreter's job entailed or what an interpreter's day might look like, but it was recommended to me as a career, so I pursued it. It wasn't until I was a student at the U of A when I finally saw working interpreters in my classroom. And that solidified for me that I really wanted to be an interpreter. Those interpreters who I saw in the classroom eventually became mentors, two of whom were Heather Donnell and Amy Druick, and they're both still interpreters in Tucson today.
That's awesome. It's great to hear how you were inspired by those interpreters, one of which might be interviewed tomorrow. We'll see. What was your first official interpreting job or experience?
After graduating from the University of Arizona, my first interpreting position was here in the Valley with Mesa Public Schools. I was with Mesa Public Schools for a short time before moving out of state, where I started working in video relay service, and I worked in VRS for about 10 years.
Wow, 10 years is a long time. What has your experience been like as you've grown into a seasoned interpreter?
Interpreting is a challenging career. It required a lot of unlearning on my part. The practice of interpreting requires the scaffolding of knowledge and skills, and that can take time. I like the concept of failing forward, meaning anytime you fail or make a mistake, learn from the mistake and move on. Use that mistake as a learning experience and fail forward. It's okay to make mistakes.
Yeah, that's a new term for me. To fail forward. In other words, if you fail, just keep on moving. Sort of like if you fall, get back up and keep on going. During the COVID-19 pandemic, did you experience any frustrations? And what strategies did you use to maintain your sanity in the VRI environment? And do you have any advice or tips you can share?
A challenge for me during COVID has been Zoom fatigue and the eye strain that comes with looking at a computer screen all day. Another challenge for me is that I'm working from home, and so the work-life balance is a bit more blurred. I have to force myself to get out of the house to go for a walk, and walking really helps me to decompress. I've also noticed that at the end of a Zoom meeting, or if we're using a different platform, everyone logs off really quickly, and I don't have the opportunity to debrief with my team interpreter afterward or to ask the deaf client if everything went well or if there's anything I can do better next time. That's a bit of a bummer for me during COVID times while using VRI, but it has forced me to do more self-analysis.
That's a wonderful point. I never thought about debriefing afterwards. That is one of the negative factors about VRI calls. Thank you for that great advice. It's important to keep that in mind. Can you share a highlight of your interpreting career?
The highlight of my interpreting career. It's difficult to pinpoint one thing, but I will mention that interpreting national conferences has been incredibly challenging and rigorous, but satisfying work. A highlight that I would say would be getting my national legal interpreter certification, which took a lot of preparation and work to receive. The most satisfying part of my job, though, is seeing connections made, seeing people thrive, seeing relationships built. I think interpreters are more than just communication facilitators. I think that we help build relationships as well.
It's good that you were able to achieve one of your milestones, the Specialist Legal Certification for Interpreters. And I'm sure you've seen so much that it's hard to choose just one highlight when there are so many. But that's a big one that can definitely impact your career. What advice can you give to new interpreters?
My advice for new interpreters would be kind to yourself. You will make mistakes, but I encourage you to fail forward. Another recommendation that I have for new interpreters is as you're developing your ASL vocabulary, work on strengthening your English vocabulary as well. I also have two resources that I recommend for new interpreters to read, and these resources talk about how we as interpreters interpret meaning and thoughts, not words. The first resource is an article by Dennis Coakley titled Interpreting Culturally Rich Realities Research Implications for Successful Interpretations. The second resource is a book by Deborah Tannen called That's Not What I Meant. And this book is about different communication styles.
Those are two wonderful books, especially Dennis Coakley's book, which I've read, but I haven't read the second book you referenced, which is now on my list. Two books which I highly recommend interpreters read. Okay, and that concludes our interview.
Hello there. Let's start with the interview. First, what's your name and where did you train and what sort of experience have you had?
Hi, thank you for the opportunity to be interviewed today. I'm Amy Druick, and I am an Arizona native who currently lives in Tucson, Arizona. I started my training at the University of Arizona, where I graduated with a degree in Deaf Studies. I then went to Gallaudet University and earned my master's degree in interpreting, and I'm a current PhD candidate at Gallaudet University studying interpretation and translation research. And I've been interpreting for almost 25 years.
Who or what inspired you to become an interpreter?
My journey to become an interpreter is interesting. I never set an initial goal to become an interpreter. I initially became interested in ASL when I was 8. I had a friend whose sister was deaf. I would go over to their house and everybody could sign, which I was completely enthralled with. At that time, there were no ASL classes offered in K through 12 setting. But through my life experiences, I saw ASL in different places and had that fascination until finally I entered college and I was able to sign up for my first ASL class where I started taking ASL my sophomore year. And that's when I completely dove in. I changed my major to Deaf Studies and studied at the University of Arizona. While I was at U of A during my junior and senior year, I lived and worked at the Arizona State Schools for the Deaf and Blind and also worked for the Community Outreach Program for the Deaf. So I had deaf community members encouraging me down a specific path. And then also I had one professor at U of A, Cindy Volk, who encouraged me to go to Gallaudet to learn how to become an interpreter. And I did. I trained as an interpreter at Gallaudet, and when I graduated, I moved back home here to Tucson.
Wow, that's so nice. It's interesting that it all began when you were small and you were observing your friends' family signing to one another. And that's where it all started. Tell us about your first official interpreting job. What was that like?
I have been thinking on this question and trying to remember my first official interpreting assignment. And I can't, it's been so long ago, 25 years ago. But what I remember most is prior to going to Gallaudet, I already had a strong connection with both the deaf and interpreting communities in Tucson. So when I came back, all I felt was support and care and encouragement, which helped me feel safe and as though I had support all along the way. That really helped me become the interpreter that I am today. And that's what I remember most. So my first experiences coming back from Gallaudet were being lifted up and cared for by the communities.
What has your experience been like as you've grown into becoming a seasoned interpreter?
I've always wanted and strive to be a better, more effective interpreter. I love language, I love learning. So I've always sought opportunities to help me become more effective in my practice, whether that be through more college courses, through workshops or study groups, or a whole host of other opportunities, whatever is available. I have done study on specialized areas of practice, medical, mental health, and legal, to help me become more prepared and to continue to grow as an interpreter who can work in those specialized settings. And in general, I'm always trying to learn new things. So I guess I have the soul of a lifelong learner.
Yes, the learning never stops. Many interpreters during COVID-19 had to transition over to video remote interpreting work. During your transition, how did you get through it successfully? And do you have any tips for other interpreters who had to make that transition and still are trying to make it work?
That's a great question. So when COVID first hit and the transition started, I had already experienced working in different settings through video remote interpreting. So I had already kind of gone through the frustrations and the learning curve, which was fortunate for me. One issue that I had initially is that when the transition first started, many of the interpreting requests were not being made. So deaf individuals didn't have access to their regular appointments, which was really heart-wrenching. So I tried to make sure that I was championing those types of requests to make sure that they were happening. And initially for me, in the transition, the most important thing was setting up my space so that I could provide the best, most clear interpretation with a clear connection and background. So I did the experiment of buying different types of lights, and I got the top internet speed, and I had to get a new computer because mine was a little too old to provide good services, so that I knew if people contracted with me, I could provide effective interpreting through video remote capabilities. I also learned a lot about the various platforms such as Zoom, how to make sure that they can be set to be most accessible for interpreting so that I can support other interpreters, deaf consumers, and the people who were requesting and hiring interpreters so that hopefully by working together, the situation and experience could be effective. I've also been working a lot on how to team effectively with other interpreters remotely. So trying different techniques so that we feel like we're together and can support one another, even though we're not in the same room. My tips for people who are getting ready to start working remotely are some of the things that I already mentioned. Make sure that your computer is up to date, that you have the right lighting and background, that you have the highest speed internet you can have in your area. That just ensures that you can provide the best access. At the same time, you really need to delve deep into the technologies and learn about the various platforms, what techniques and different options there are to make sure that people who are using the interpreter can see the interpreter clearly and know how to find the interpreter. Zoom has great features and has those capabilities. With other platforms, you kind of have to delve in and figure out their options. So you really need to become well versed in the platforms and also the unique tools that you need to make sure that you can be effective as an interpreter through video remote interpreting.
What's the highlight of your interpreting career?
I have a few highlights that I'd like to share. One thing I feel very fortunate about is that I've been connected with the Arizona deaf, blind, and hard of hearing communities for almost 30 years. So it feels like my home. It's a very special highlight for me. Secondly, I've been fortunate enough to be able to travel and interpret throughout the United States, which has allowed me to expand my interpreting community and expand my deaf communities through those experiences, which has been a huge highlight. And lastly, now that I've been in the field for 25 years, I feel a highlight is that I can use my knowledge and my skill to support newer interpreters who are coming into the field. So I am able to lift them up and support them just like I was lifted up and supported by the communities when I was a newer interpreter.
Now for our last question. Do you have any advice or suggestions for new interpreters in the field?
I would say just keep learning, never stop learning. Get involved and connected with your blind, and hard of hearing communities. And now with virtual connections, you can even grow those communities. You can have larger connections to deaf and interpreting communities. For me, I would say always strive to be the best interpreter that you can be. We are part of a practice profession. That means that we have to practice to make sure that we are continuing to learn and grow as practitioners. I think the most important thing would be to support one another. Look for opportunities where you can learn together as a community, where you can support one another with your goals, or you can find your people that will be your support system. So that could be your classmates, newer interpreters like you, mentors, former instructors, deaf community members, people that you care about and who care about you, so that you can have a network of support as you continue to grow in your practice. Because the ultimate goal is to provide the best access we can for the deaf, deafblind, and hard of hearing communities.